Originating from Chico State University, welcome to The Real Issue. As we continue our discussion of the California drought, we focus tonight on current water storage strategies and possibly the need for new strategies. California's rainfall is extremely variable. It is seasonally variable across year-to-year comparisons and over long, wet and dry periods, including century-long droughts. The interchangeable use of surface and groundwater, depending on precipitation levels, has ensured access to water for population centers, agriculture, and the environment. And natural as well as man-made storage projects have leveled out seasonal variability of water access. As global temperatures rise, it seems, however, that one reliable water storage system is no longer available. The snowpack in the Sierra Nevada mountains is at a record low, and growing concerns about water availability in the summer months are calling for new storage strategies. To talk about whether new storage strategy projects are the solution is the Executive Director of the Sacramento River Trust, Lucas Ross Mers. I'm happy to have you here with us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me, Sue.
So Lucas, start by making that connection, that water cycle between the snowpack in the Sierras and the summertime access to water.
Definitely, yeah, this year was rough. Snowpack is an all-time low. Our snow counts and our snowpack assessments this year put it at 3% of average in the early spring. And that's normally a 15 million acre-foot storage system for Northern California and the entire state. So as we progress into the growing period of 2015, it's going to be a really tough year for us. That is the cheapest dam we've never had to build. It is also really good at reflecting the sun's rays. It doesn't evaporate. It recharges our groundwater in the North State. And so as we progress through the year, without the snowpack, we have one pool of water in each reservoir. So when we have Shasta Dam and we have Oroville Dam and we have our other surface storage projects, we're not dealing with a project that's going to be recharged as the snow slowly melts through the spring and summer months, which would normally recharge or refill our surface water storage systems. That allows us to have greater variability and flexibility in how we deliver water to our different contractual obligations, both with the state and federal systems. And in Northern California, it really affects our groundwater recharge. Groundwater recharge depends greatly on tributary flows in our streams, as well as the Sacramento River. So without the snowpack and without that natural built reservoir system, we are definitely going to face some strategic struggles. And we're going to have to make cuts where necessary. The governor has already moved forward on some of those at the urban, agricultural, and industrial level. And we will see how it affects Northern California as we progress.
So Lucas, one of the, we talk about rising global temperatures. And in a sense, when we have snow, we have snowpack in the winter and it melts into the summer. And I'm wondering, is it a matter of we have this drought where we're not getting precipitation? If it weren't so warm, would we have a snowpack? Or is it a matter of there simply wasn't enough precipitation at all?
Well, the climatologist for the state of California said it really well in 2014 at a seminar with some of the representatives from Australia as well, when he talks about atmospheric rivers and our whole system that comes up from the equator, basically, that brings these atmospheric rivers up to meet the jet stream and bring us our moisture. It's a very dynamic system, and we can't really predict it. So the climatologists in Australia, their climate predictions were 2050 was basically similar to what they experienced in their millennium drought. Here in California now, we're moving into a drought that's very scary for us because if we don't get the snowpack that we're looking for, there's really no storage that can replace that. It's going to take new strategies and new thinking, and we're really hoping that there'll be some new ideas that come out. But yeah, without the snowpack, there's really no way to replace that kind of storage.
Okay, and so before we talk about how we're going to replace the snowpack, the 15 million acre feet, is that right?
That's correct.
How are we going to replace 15 million acre feet? How do we have that available in the summertime? Before we even go there, I want to ask you, let's talk about the reality of how water is being used. And we talk about surface water, which is the snow melt, and that's the rivers and the streams and the lakes. And we talk about groundwater. And what I think a lot of folks don't realize is we use both of those things for all of our needs, the population centers, agriculture, and for the environment. So talk about what's known as conjunctive use. What is that?
Conjunctive use is something we've been doing for a very long time. Conjunctive use is basically using surface water when you have it and switching on the pumps and going to groundwater when you don't. It's a very basic principle of if we have extra or if we have flows, then our farmers and our urban centers and other users are able to use surface water to satisfy their needs for the seasons. If that's not available, then we switch to groundwater. And in some areas, we don't have access to surface water. Butte County is 65% groundwater pretty much across the board. Most of Northern California, especially on the east side, doesn't really have surface water delivery unless they have riparian rights. On the west side, you have several irrigation districts which allow for surface water delivery, but we've been heavily reliant on groundwater in Northern California. In other areas, they have surface water that comes from Northern California or other sources that's delivered across the entire state. So conjunctive use is really just the combination of using surface water and groundwater when we have it.
So when we have wet years, we're going to use surface water, and the idea that the groundwater is recharged. And then when we have dry years, for example, right now, we're starting to see those wells drop, the water levels in the wells drop because people are pumping groundwater. It's interesting when you say that because I think most folks don't have water rights, which means they don't have surface water rights, and they can only rely on a well. And so, one of the next strategies is how do we have conjunctive use management, which would require that we have an understanding of the groundwater use levels, evaluate it, and that's very new for California. So what needs to happen in order to have good conjunctive management practices in California?
You can't manage what you can't meter. And so that's really what the governor's new SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, is all about. Took a lot of political action and energy to try to get that through. California is way behind our other western state partners in trying to really meter and manage our groundwater. We've pretty much had the Old West for a very long time. And so now we're moving into an era where we're going to start to create groundwater management agents. We're going to come up with sustainable groundwater management plans. And you can't have conjunctive management until you manage your groundwater. We know a lot about how we get surface water from point A to point B, but we don't know a lot about groundwater. And so conjunctive management really won't come around until we can manage groundwater supplies and deliveries. That's looking like another 15 years. So we're going to have conjunctive use, whether it's sustainable or not, but we won't have sustainable groundwater management for another 10 to 15 years. So conjunctive use is a constant, and it's kind of a natural process for us. Conjunctive management, that's something for the future.
And we're in a drought right now. So one of the things that has come out of this drought is in 2014 we had the passage of Proposition 1. Voters approved Proposition 1, and it was to address the future water needs. And part of Proposition 1 was $2.7 billion is allocated very specifically for water storage projects. And the legislation says for a project to be funded, it has to show that they have measurable improvements to the delta. These projects have ecosystem improvement, they have water quality improvement, flood control benefits, and emergency response. And I have to say, these requirements for $2.7 billion for water storage projects sounds too good to be true. So I want to ask you, who makes decisions on what gets funded and how are those projects evaluated?
Yeah, that was a big one. And a lot of constituents in California looked at that very carefully, that I work with at the Trust. And it's continually appropriated by the California Water Commission. California Water Commission members are appointed by the governor, And they're coming up with right now, they're holding meetings throughout Northern California and the state to talk about how they're going to accept basically proposals for storage projects and how they're going to evaluate those based on public benefit. So any project that can receive part of that $2.7 billion has to show 50% benefit to public based on those 5 categories that you talked about right there. So whether it's to salmon or whether it's to flood control or whether it's to helping the delta and recovery of species and the protections there, they're going to have to prove that benefit to our public so that they can receive public dollars. The public voted for Proposition 1 in a bond. In the end, we all know that $2.7 billion is a drop in the bucket. Our levees need repair. Our storage facilities need repair. Our bridges, our cross gates, our bypasses, our weirs. This is a lot of stuff that's been built over a very long time. And so this is kind of just the beginning of trying to really come at flood control and multi-benefit projects in a new way with Department of Water Resources, all of the fisheries and wildlife agencies, our federal and state partners, our regional entities. The Central Valley Flood Protection Control Board is going to have a big part in this. But yeah, the California Water Commission is going to control those storage funds.
And it's hard to sort of wrap your mind around. I think the entire Proposition 1 was about $7 billion. And that's all taxpayers' money. And 2.7 of that goes to water storage projects. And as you said, it's 50% has to go to public benefit. And so that other 50%, who benefits from taxpayer money?
That's a good question. Trying to get buy-in, whether it's municipal water districts, if it's private entities, if it's irrigation districts, the higher the water market drives the price per acre foot, the more it looks like it's a good investment to invest in storage, because you actually get to dictate the terms of your contractual obligation for those funds. So if they are able to get appropriated, and most of that $2.7 billion is going to go into planning, if they're able to, then they get to dictate how and when they get their water.
So when you say that when the prices of water rise, then it's a good idea to invest in water storage. And you were saying you will be able to control it. When you say is it a handful of individuals? Is it a municipality? Or does it depend on who controls that water storage project?
Who put the money on the table to build it?
Okay. All right.
Whether it's an irrigation district, a municipality, if you're wealthy enough to do it yourself, then yeah, maybe your own private ranch.
So taxpayers really need to have close watch over how this money is going to be spent.
I would concur.
So one of the water projects that really is talked about, I think, more than any others, water storage project, is Sites Reservoir. And it's located in Glenn County. It's just west of Colusa. First of all, talk about what this project proposes to do.
Sites Reservoir has been worked on for 20 years. And a lot of people in Northern California and across the state would say that they wish it was built 20 years ago because prevailing wage and the cost of construction has gone up. But there are some concerns from other entities, and we still have yet to see an environmental impact report for that site. They have a joint powers authority, and it's basically a north of Delta offstream storage project. NODOS is the acronym for that. And these were investigated after most of the major dam sites were already taken up. This is not the beginning of dam building. This is the end of dam building to an extent. We've dammed a lot of the most beneficial and resourceful areas. Off-stream storage means that there's not really a watershed that fills that reservoir. These are going to be reservoirs that are artificially filled or mechanically filled. So Sites Reservoir is right now, the way the project is set, is a 1.8 million acre foot reservoir on the west side of the valley. And the idea is that we would, in times of high flows in the winter, divert at the Tehama-Colusa Canal Authority location at the Red Bluff Diversion Dam, and we would divert at the Glen-Colusa Irrigation District pumping facility at the Oxbow right there in Hamilton City. The idea is to take those high flows and basically divert that along the west side and then pump it up and in to this new reservoir. It could create recreational benefit. It could have some benefits to giving warmer water to the rice growers on the west side. And most of the benefit they talk about to the public is allowing that water to offset the cold water storage in Shasta. However, this is the end of dam building like we talked about. And so I think there's a lot of us that are really hopeful that we'll look at Sites Reservoir, we'll look at Temperance Flat, we'll look at raising San Luis Reservoir, we'll look at the raising of Shasta Dam, we'll look at these short benefits, but also compare that to the loss of snowpack. It's going to be very hard to get 15 million acre feet of benefit from any more storage projects.
Well, exactly, and the other part of that is you said 1.7, 1.8 million acre feet in Sites Reservoir, and we're losing 15 million acre feet because there's no snow melt, there's no snowpack, and the water would be directed, it would be pumped, it's not a natural place for a reservoir to exist. So I'm wondering, if the Shasta Dam is so low, how come in high times, high precipitation times, the water is just not added to Shasta Dam? I mean, it's going to be a very long time before that is full.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. You saw the floods of December in 2014, right? We literally had some pretty big flows this last year. That's because of unrestricted tributaries. So if we're going to get more precipitation in the form of rain, there are a lot of tributaries that don't have dams on them. And so that doesn't fall above Shasta Dam kind of flows down these tributaries and hits the Sacramento and is able to raise that to flood stage. Those are the flows that they're trying to grab. It's these extra flows that aren't falling behind Shasta Dam, but are falling below Shasta Dam in the western and eastern tributaries that are rushing down the valley. And that's really what they're hoping to divert to the west side and put into Sites Reservoir.
And there are a lot of concerns. I know that there's a lot of environmental concerns about Sites Reservoir, and I know that the environmental studies have not been completed yet. But my most basic question is, if you start to divert these waters, what does that do to the fisheries downstream? So talk about some of the environmental concerns of building Sites Reservoir.
Yeah, well, we definitely want to flush the young salmon out to the delta into the ocean. But it's really complex when you get to that, because the way that our delta and our levee systems were built was to get rid of mine trailings. And basically to move the sediment that came out of hydraulic mining out of our streams. We no longer have mining, and so now we're looking at setback levees and floodplain recapture and different types of multi-benefit management. And so that kind of fits in with the Sites Reservoir concept of, let's not just push a bunch of water through these tight levee systems, but let's actually spread it back out or hold it for later use. Because we've moved a lot of that sediment out. The jury's still out on really the best use of that water, but it would be a hard place to live if we didn't have flushing flows out the delta into the bay. We definitely need some of those flushing flows. How much we need and what Department of Water Resources and USBR and the different entities are working on. So yeah, it's definitely tough.
And there's so many interests involved, public interest, private interest, things like that. And the environmental studies haven't come back yet. And I go back to, the legislation says projects are eligible for funding if they have measurable improvements to the delta, system improvements, things like that. And so I just wonder if Sites Reservoir will even be eligible, but we won't know that until some of the results come back. Lucas, through conversations we've had, I know that the whole idea of surface water storage is not really your first choice, and it's more of recharging the aquifer. It's actually groundwater storage. Talk about some of the issues involved in why you think that's a better idea than grabbing the surface water.
we know that there's an inextricable link or an undeniable connection between surface flows and groundwater. And so as our groundwater drops, our tributaries, our streams, our Mill Creek, our Deer Creek, our Antelope Creek in Northern California are going drier earlier and earlier in spring. And that's a big concern for our farmers in Northern California, for our fisheries, and for our habitat in general. And so trying to figure out how we can put back some water into the groundwater, to take it away from evaporation in reservoirs. And to really figure out that, I'd love to see some plans go forward. Floodplain ecology as well is really exciting to me. Moving water off stream, but not necessarily into a canal, but into wetlands, into floodplains where we rear young salmon. There's some great projects going on right now in the Yola Bypass and even up here in Northern California, trying to look at the benefits and the growth rates of juvenile salmon across floodplains. Where that water isn't wasted, it's still recaptured at the end, and there's even ecosystem services in terms of cleaning water and other things. But I really hope that some of this money, because this isn't the first bond we're going to see, or this is, well, we've spent over $20 billion in bonds in the last 10 years. But we're going to see more bonds because California, one of the largest economies in the world, one of the biggest agricultural producers, some of the largest urban centers, some of the most valuable environmental resources in the world. We're going to need to spend a lot more money to preserve what we have and to guarantee a sustainable future and to restructure our infrastructure to be ready for the future.
I hear what you're saying about, in terms of environmental concerns, about groundwater storage is a better strategy as opposed to surface water storage. And I guess maybe some of the concern of the concerns for farmers, for example, is that if you recharge the aquifer, they might not have access to it, or it's a matter of where that water goes. It's all sort of a mystery. So we're not quite sure how it gets in there. And so to actually think about recharging the aquifer, what do you say to somebody that has a concern that says, I want to be able to look at that reservoir and know where my water is going to come from?
I would probably tell those farmers that Shasta Dam wasn't necessarily built for Northern California farmers in the first place. It was built to protect Sacramento, and it was built to supply water to the agriculturists that were moving west during the Dust Bowl and the New Deal. The State Water Project in Oroville is city water. We have riparian rights and appropriative rights, and in some ways to gather that water and to still use some of our historic rights. But Northern California is a groundwater-dependent region, and I would highly doubt that there's many entities that can afford the water.
And what just hit me as you said that is, you said Shasta Dam is a federally funded project, and it was built very specifically to bring water down to the southern part of California. And I wonder who's going to come up with the money to build Site's reservoir. If only 50% have to go to public use, then the water that's collected, theoretically, could it belong to somebody that has nothing to do with Northern California?
That is definitely possible.
It's a concern, yeah.
And it's a concern, but it's also part of the water market. We would use some of it. And the way that water moves is very dynamic. There's state and federal water controllers that work together. So their water could, Site's water could hit rice fields on the west side, and they could use water from Shasta that's moving down to the Delta to pump out. It's all in a big bank.
But it all depends on who owns that bank.
Who owns that water?
Who owns the bank? Lucas, let's be honest here. Any project, whether it's research and development of recharging the aquifer, or it's building a new reservoir, or raising Shasta Dam, these are long-term projects. And the reality is we're in drought now. There's no end in sight. We're seeing wells drop, a lot of concern. The truth is there's more water claimed than there is water. And so the reality is we need to start, quote, conserving, and that means not using that water. And so I want to ask you, who, in terms of prioritizing water use, who would you advocate for not using water? Whose water would you cut?
Put me on the spot. But, when I always love to look at Australia as an example because they just went through this. And Jane Doolan, when she came down with the state climatologist at this great forum last year. She talked about how they divided the water. And she basically talked about agricultural producers that had to pretty much stop producing. I mean, their cotton and their alfalfa in Australia pretty much went away. Their perennials sacrificed a third of their acreage. They brought all their top scientists together and came out with their drought refuge zones, the places that animals went in times of drought, and made sure they had guaranteed water. In California, there's kind of, a bad guy that we've all looked at, and that's Westlands. Westlands Water District on the west side of the San Joaquin, from their problems with migrating waterfowl to them hitting the saline level of, basically over drilling into their aquifer, and just kind of the corporate agricultural monster that gets created when there's profit over next generation farmer concerns. I would love to see Westlands retired. I think there's a lot of people in California who would love to see that. I think that there'll be a buyout from the federal or state government to help them with that, but that would be my low-hanging fruit that I say, this is just a bad example of agriculture in California.
And it's not a sustainable example of agriculture in California.
It's frustrating for many people.
One of the questions I have is, if Prop 1's $7 billion to deal with water storage, I wonder if we could make that argument by retiring particular water uses. Could we argue that would somehow protect our water access?
And this brings up the complexity of California water. You have federal contracts, you have state contracts, you have regional and local understandings. It's very hard to try to manage water in California when you have to deal with all of the different interests involved, from senators to congressmen, those that fly to Washington, D.C., and those that fly to Sacramento. So I think that we're just beginning. But I also hope that we are planning for the future and we're not planning for drought. We need to be very realistic. We need to look at this as an opportunity to make some very serious changes, and to really hope that we're leaving the best California for the next generation.
Lucas, thanks for being here. It's a very complicated issue. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you being here and help us understand.
Thank you so much, Sue.
And tune in next time as we talk about conservation strategies here in the agricultural industry and in your home. Thanks for joining us tonight on The Real Issue.